Dragon Bond, Chapter 10. Selena helped Zala raise the command tent again, while the men worked on the rest of the camp. All except one tent had been flattened in the battle. Full darkness had fallen, and they lit a few lanterns to help them see what they were doing. Zala could feel Talon's brooding eyes upon her. He had helped them find branches that could be used as an impromptu tent poles, but he hadn't spoken to her since she had rejected his request for his freedom. She couldn't blame him. A part of her felt some vindication that a dragon was getting to feel what it was like to be forced to cower from a large, powerful creature, one that was nearly impossible to defeat without a storm sword. Even with one, victory was never assured. A part of her was proud that he'd stood up to the big female, even wounding her. He had suffered enough as a human, imprisoned in that mine for a year. He didn't need to suffer any further. If she did free him, he could take care of himself when that female dragon came around. He could even be an asset, helping them to fight. If he would help them. She had no guarantee of that. Even though he said otherwise now, he could easily turn on her people. If another dragon showed up, one who wasn't trying to kill him, but who wanted to help him escape, as Zala guessed that second dragon had been trying to do, what would he do then? Surely he would choose his own kind over them. Over her. Even if all he did was fly away when he had the power to do so, that would upset her. The next time they met, it would be as enemies, and she wouldn't have gotten any intelligence or anything useful out of the deal. Worse than that, she would know him, and it would be much harder to kill someone she knew, even a dragon. Looks like you've got some extra venting that wasn't part of the original design, ma'am. Selena poked a hand through the rip in the tent wall. At least it's standing. Zala might not have bothered erecting the tent again since they were breaking the camp in the morning, but the canvas walls, no matter how ripped, would give her some privacy in case she wanted to talk to Talon. She snorted at herself. Talking, yes, that's what she had in mind. The skirmish should have driven all thoughts of sex from her mind, especially when that female knew where they were and might attack again at any time. But Zala couldn't help but think of Sandra's suggestion. It had been as if he'd given her permission to do what she'd wanted to do anyway. But he wanted her to sleep with Talon in order to get information, so that he might remember her fondly later. That did not seem honorable. It seemed manipulative, and she had always loathed manipulative women. She preferred to talk straight and to get what she wanted by using a sword rather than feminine wiles. No, her original thought was correct. She should keep space between herself and Talon, and not let anything happen. Anything else. Selena walked over with a broken stick in her hand. I think this is what's left of your table. It's firewood now, Zala said. At least she had found her tile set and her coffee pot. She had missed her coffee the previous morning, and she fully intended to rise early enough to make some before heading out. Some luxuries could not be sacrificed, even in the field. Selena yawned and tossed the table leg aside. Zala patted her on the arm. Neither of them had slept the night before, and she felt guilty for keeping her lieutenant awake. Thanks for your help. Get some sleep. We'll leave at dawn. The sooner we get into the tunnels where that female dragon can't follow us, the better. Agreed. Selena saluted and headed away. She sneaked a long look at Talon as she went. He now leaned against a tree, his jacket still open, just enough lantern light reaching him to highlight the bumps and valleys of his muscled abdomen. Maybe Selena intended to find her private spot by the creek again. Zala doused all except one of the lanterns, picked it up, and lifted the tent flap. Why don't you come in and I'll bandage your wound, she asked, meeting Talon's eyes. I believe my first aid kit survived the attack. And then? He asked, his eyes hard to read in the shadows. And then you can get some sleep, here or outside. She shrugged, trying to suggest that she did not care either way, but she wanted to keep an eye on him so he wouldn't sneak out to meet that other dragon. Sure, Zala, that's the reason you want him in the tent. Talon pushed away from the tree and walked toward the tent. He ducked inside, and she followed him in, her stomach fluttering as nerves teased it. She didn't know why. She was going to bandage him. That was it. The cot lay sideways on the ground, and Talon set it upright and draped the blanket over it. Zala rested the lantern in the corner, missing her table already. She had set her tile set and dented coffee pot and tin mug over there, too. She pulled her first aid kit out of her rucksack and grabbed a canteen. Have a seat, she said, waving at the cot, the only remaining furniture. Talon stood in the middle of the tent, his hands clasped behind his back, his head lowered, because the replacement support pole was not as tall as the original had been. The canvas drooped, brushing his hair. I will not leave if you cut off my collar. Not until I have helped you, as I said I would. Zala sighed. She had feared he would ask again. Take off your jacket, please. He blinked and looked down at his chest. "So I can wash your wound," she said. "Oh." He winced as he drew his injured arm from the sleeve. Zala poured the water onto a clean rag in the kit and stepped close, dabbing it to the gouged flesh. Once again she grew aware of his body, of how close they stood to each other, of how easy it would be to run her hand down his muscled arm. His head turned, those violet eyes gazing at her, watching her work. She made herself focus on the wound and nothing more. As soon as she had cleaned it, she laid a bandage over it, wishing she had some healer's poultice to keep infection away. Could dragons get infections? Who knew? "Thank you," he said quietly as she finished. "I regret that I need you to save me so often." He did not add that he would not need saving if he could shapeshift, but she knew he was thinking it again. "You weren't doing half bad with those tent poles," Zala said. "Yes, I nearly knocked off one of Semtrusus's pimples." She snorted. "Do dragons have pimples?" More of a scale rot that we find irritating." "Well, I believe you did more than irritate the female dragon." "Perhaps." Zala finished with the bandage and stepped back, pleased that she had resisted the urge towards unprofessional touching. "I would like to do more than irritate her," Talon said, running a finger over his collar. "And the same is true for Hool. I do not want them to lead my kind any longer." Zala removed her sword belt and sat on one end of the cot. She threaded her fingers together, leaned on her forearms, on her thighs, and stared down at her clasped hands. "I know you want that collar off, but my people are made uneasy by your presence already. Seeing you without it, with your pretty purple eyes flashing at them, would make them question my sanity." Zala smiled wryly. "Maybe they're already questioning it. I believe that you mean what you're telling me now, but I worry you'll have different thoughts once you're back in dragon form. None of your kind has ever given us a reason to trust you, and I keep thinking you're using some magic on me, even now, and that I'm being very foolish for falling for your—" She waved toward his bare torso, wondering what he would think if she returned to kissing his chest. "My—" Talon touched his chest and looked down as if he couldn't imagine what she meant. Maybe he couldn't. She didn't want to explain the appeal of licking those ridges of muscles, of hailing his heady scent, or burying her face in his taut flesh and rubbing herself against him. "Falling for you. For human you. You don't think you could fall for dragon me?" She certainly couldn't imagine licking something scaly, especially if scale rot was involved. She smiled sadly at him. "I don't think dragon you would be the same being." Talon sat on the other end of the cot, leaving a couple of feet between them. Zala wished the space was not there, but he hadn't hovered close since she had corrected him on it earlier that day. Now she wished she hadn't. "I don't understand why you would be interested in human me at all." Talon sounded truly puzzled. "I don't know how to fight in this form, and you keep having to save my miserable life." His face twisted into that expression of disgust again. "I make a pitiful human. I don't know how some of you became such competent warriors." His distress at his failings made her want to comfort him. Strange, because she usually wasn't drawn to men who questioned themselves. In the past she had always been attracted to confident men, other officers usually. Of course she hadn't known any unconfident men who looked like him, and had eyes that scorched her from the outside in when he looked at her. Besides, he could have easily been an arrogant human, given all the powers and competence he'd had as a dragon. Perhaps the year in the pit had bled any such feelings out of him. "If I free you before we go," Zala said, "your people would know you were betraying them. If I wait until afterward, you can pretend you had no choice, which is true, since you gave your word. But not everyone would understand keeping one's word to one's enemies. Appearances must matter to your kind, too." "Appearances matter, but I don't care. Hool has turned me from a loyal subject into an enemy, and keeping one's word is important no matter who was the recipient of that word. Besides, I no longer think of you as an enemy." "No?" "I care about you, and I wish to mate with you." Zala looked up and found those smoldering eyes upon her. Even though that couple of feet of space still lay between them, he seemed much closer now. "I am surprised, given of what you've experienced of human mating so far." "As am I, but I think my body knows." He looked toward his trousers and shook his head wryly. "It seems certain it would find an experience with you pleasurable. And you are, after all, the one who slew my tormentor." His gaze met hers again, his brows rising. "Is it not normal for me to feel something toward you?" He shifted closer on the cot, and his presence seemed to engulf her. A thought rose in her mind, of dropping to her knees in front of him, of using her mouth to give him the pleasure he desired, of showing him that humans could indeed enjoy sex. Strange, since she had rarely felt such an urge towards a man. She had always been too proud, always the officer, the commander, and worried it would somehow lessen her to take a subservient position. And yet the idea of doing so with him titillated her. But will you remember these feelings of yours when you're a dragon again? Zala wondered, staring back into his eyes. She wasn't sure she could look away if she wanted to. Surely Sandra was wrong, and Talon had some degree of magic about him even with the collar on. "I'm certain I will," Talon said. "I respected you before I ever took this form." "When you were trying to kill me, you were respecting me?" "Very much so." He tilted his head. A rare hint of uncertainty entered his eyes. "Did you have no respect for me?" "I respected that you could flick a finger and kill me." His brow furrowed. Apparently that wasn't the answer he had hoped for. "I'm afraid we were too busy being terrified of your kind to worry about whether or not you're honorable or respectable opponents. Surely you must understand that after spending time as a human, especially after tonight." She waved her hand to indicate his injury. "I did believe that you weren't as cruel as many of the other dragons, but you were deadly, and maybe even worse than the bloodthirsty ones because of your single-minded efficiency." "I see." This time Talon was the one to clasp his hands together and study them thoughtfully. "Yes, after some Truces' attacks, I do see that we are quite large and intimidating. I have battled many dragons, and I was never afraid of them the way I was tonight, when I had no way to defend myself, and no effective way to attack back. I have become quite aware of the vulnerability of this form." He lifted a hand, not to touch his bandage, but to trace the lip of an old wound, one of those whip scars, one that curled over the top of his shoulder to lick his collarbone. Before she could think better of it, Zala scooted close enough to place a hand on the scar. He grew still, lowering his chin to watch her hand. Whatever he had been before, he had not deserved this last year. If he had truly received his punishment because he had spoken up in favor of ending the slaughter of her people, how could she not trust him? How could she not care for him? Maybe she already did. Tonight, when she had seen that the massive dragon charging at him, terror had leapt into her throat. Not terror for herself, but a terror for him, for his safety. It seemed silly, since she had known him such a short time, but already she hated the idea of someone hurting him, of someone killing him. She bent and kissed the scar, letting her lips linger as she breathed in his scent. He smelled earthy from being thrown to the ground, she supposed, but not unpleasant. It made her realize that he had smelled clean earlier when they had kissed, masculine and warm. He had either sneaked a bath somewhere or his dragon magic kept him from stinking of the road. She smiled slightly, amused by the thought of body odor that could be vanquished by magic. "It's a good sign when a woman kisses you and smiles, yes?" Talon said, his face closer to hers than it had been a moment earlier. His eyes closed to slits, and he watched her through his lashes. As always, that look alone had power to heat her body, turning her core molten before he had ever laid a hand on her. "I think so," she murmured, kissing his shoulder again, and sliding her hands around his torso and to his back, following the contours of his muscles, feeling the angry scar tissue, some old and faded, some recent enough that she worried the touch might hurt him. She was careful around those. "What would you think if I seduced you?" "I would wholeheartedly approve of that." "I must warn you, I have ulterior motives." "Oh?" She sighed and leaned back enough to meet his eyes. "My colonel thought it would be a good idea." "Your colonel?" "Yes, I admitted that you seemed interested in me, and he suggested that you might be less likely to annihilate our unit later if you have fond memories of sleeping with its commander." And did he also tell you to share your ulterior motives with me?" "No, but I thought you should know. I know I'd be stung if I later learned someone had lied to me and had only been using me for a selfish reason." "Only? That's the sole reason you're touching me now? And that's the reason you let me kiss you earlier? Because you want me to be fond of you later, when I'm a dragon again?" She lowered her chin, leaning her forehead against his shoulder. "It's not the sole reason," she murmured, "but it was like having someone give you permission for something you want to do that you know is wrong and that you shouldn't do." She wasn't sure what he thought. His answers had been guarded, so she slipped her tongue out to taste him in case he was about to stop her. The heat gathering between her legs grew more intense. She wanted to slide her arms around him, feel his bare back against her face, breathe him in, kiss him, lick him, be taken by him. But she worried she would end up alone under a tree like her lieutenant. He took a deep breath and twisted toward her. He scooped her up, startling her with his strength. Did he truly think himself puny? And pulled her into his lap with his arms around her. His erection prodded her through his trousers, full and hard under her rump. His lips touched hers, and then he captured her mouth. His earlier hesitancy was gone, and he stole her breath as he kissed her with raw passion. When he pulled back several moments later, he left her gasping and longing for more. "Two things," he said, his gaze shifting from her lips to her eyes and back again. "First, you've saved my life twice and freed me from that hell. I already told you that. You don't have to mate with me to ensure I'll never hurt you. As for extending that protection to your unit, we'll see how they treat me, huh? Right now I have no reason to retaliate against them, not the way I do against my supposed king." She struggled to focus on his words, but her heart was hammering from his kiss, her desire thoroughly aroused. She shifted her weight, rubbing against his crotch, wondering what he would think if she tore off her trousers and straddled him. "Second?" she asked when he paused. "Zala," he groaned, his eyes rolling back in his head as she squirmed against him. He grasped the back of her head and kissed her again, his mouth even more demanding than before. She met his hunger with hunger of her own, grabbing his shoulders and pulling himself to him. As he kissed her, his hands found her hips and then shifted to her buttons. Remembering how long it had taken him to fasten his own buttons, she pushed herself to her feet to handle them herself. She tugged off her boots, shimmied out of her trousers, and dropped her jacket and shirt to the ground. She knew she was too lean and tough to be considered a beauty, but he stared at her as if nothing else in the world could so capture his attention. She climbed into his lap again, straddling him as she wrapped one arm behind his shoulders. The cot, meant for one and not two, groaned under their weight, but it held. He grasped her hips lightly, almost reverently, then eased his hands up to her waist, touching every inch of her, as if it was his first time holding a woman, and maybe it was. With her free hand, she trailed her fingers down his chest, scraping and stroking as she went, eventually hooking his waistband, rubbing the top button with her thumb. "What was the second thing?" she asked, watching his face. His gaze, which was so often locked onto her own, had settled lower. "What?" he whispered, and licked his lips as he eyed her breasts. "Oh, yes." He forced his gaze upward, though it slipped a few times, as if he was afraid her breasts would disappear and he needed to memorize them first. She swallowed, an emotion beyond lust causing a lump in her throat. Who would have thought someone from a different race could make her feel more alluring and desirable than any of her own people ever had? "I wanted to tell you that you don't need to seduce me, or ever talk to me again for me to think fondly of you in the future, but I'm having a hard time getting the words out." He leaned into her, his mouth finding her breast. Intense pleasure shot through her, and she gasped and dug both of her hands into his hair, pushing herself toward him. "Stay with me, Zala," Talon whispered, taking her nipple between his lips. "This is amazing. You're amazing." His words affected her as much as the touch of his mouth, of his hands. The moist heat between her thighs ached to be filled, and she shifted in his lap, pressing against the hard bulge in his trousers, rubbing against the fabric, the scraping sensation creating streaks of pleasure. But she wanted more. She wanted him, not his trousers. Why had she given him clothes to start with? "Zala," he groaned again, then gripped her with both hands to turn her so that she lay on the cot. He kept kissing her, though he shifted his body off the edge so he could remove his trousers. He almost tipped over the cot in his eagerness to disrobe without taking his lips from hers. Zala gasped, laughing once she was sure the cot wouldn't tip and dump her naked butt in the dirt. Maybe there was a reason she never took lovers while out in the field. "Sorry," he whispered, then eased back onto the cot, his elbows on either side of her, his legs across hers, his thick cock tantalizingly close to the center of her nerves, her heat, and her desire. "Dragons don't have collapsible nests. Maybe your race is wiser than I realized. Maybe." He grinned, the first time she'd seen such an expression on him. She liked it. Then he resumed kissing her, and she liked that too. His ardor left her breathless and yearning for him. He could have taken her any time, but he seemed taken with her breasts, stroking them with reverence as he explored her mouth like an expert, not like someone who'd never been kissed before that afternoon. "Tell me if I'm doing anything wrong," he blurted, surprising her. Wrong? She could barely think, and she kept pressing her body upward towards him, wanting his touch everywhere. Or if I should do anything better. I don't know. I mean, we don't. There's usually a lot of biting with my kind, and I just had this urge. He shifted and glanced toward her chest. Do humans bite? A fresh flush of heat charged through her as she imagined him nipping at her sensitive spots. Sometimes. She had been running her hands up and down his back and his sides with her eyes closed, enjoying his kisses, the press of his body against hers, but she looked at his face now, at the earnest and heated expression in his eyes. Gently. And licking is good. Sucking. Where? Anywhere you want. As soon as she spoke, she wondered if she should have been more specific. What if he nibbled on her elbow, or a toe? But he must have inherited human instincts along with his body, because he flashed another grin and lowered himself straight to her breasts. Her nipples were already peaked from his roaming fingers, from the feel of their forms molded to each other, flesh to flesh, but they hardened almost painfully as he found them with his lips. She dug her fingers into his scalp, holding her head against her, not wanting to let him escape. He traced her flat belly with his fingers as his mouth pleasured her breasts, and her belly quivered under his attention, especially when he brushed against the wiry hair below it. He moaned as he licked her, as if he'd never touched or tasted anything so wonderful as her breasts, and when he threw in a few teasing nips, her entire body shook. The cot creaked, but she no longer cared if they did end up on the ground. Her fingers slipped lower, parting her lower lips, and she was so aroused already that she bucked at the slightest touch to her sex. "Talon," she groaned, and then bit her lip, afraid if she made too much noise, everyone in camp would know what she was doing, what was being done to her. She gripped the edges of the cot, forgetting all about pleasing him, only holding on as her body trembled and arched toward him, acting independently of her mind. She couldn't have managed any coherent thoughts anyway. He paused, looking at her face. "This is all right? It feels good?" "So good." She panted, grinding against his hand. She should have told him to thrust into her then, because she knew she was on the verge of coming, but she found herself selfishly pleading for more. "Don't stop. Use your tongue. Where your fingers are. Please." She thought he might hesitate, not certain what to do, or not certain if he wanted to do it, but he hurried to shift to the end of the cot so he could dip between her legs. A raw recruit rushing to follow orders couldn't have moved more quickly or with more eagerness, and she gasped as he parted her with his tongue, his fingers curling around the edge of the cot again. He explored her with long, languid licks, like a cartographer mapping new terrain. She had no idea what dragon sex organs looked like or how mating worked for them. It didn't matter. His innocent and curious explorations left her breathless and groaning his name. Her senses reeled as the pressure within her built, the need so intense she couldn't help but thrust up toward his questioning mouth. "You taste so good," he whispered, the words muffled, his lips against her. His hand slid under her ass, molding her to him. "When do I... He found her clitoris and sucked her, and her world exploded. She cried out, forgetting the rest of the camp, forgetting everything except the waves of pleasure rocking over her. Finally, her fingers released the cot, every ounce of tension bleeding out of her body. "You're already done?" He bit his lip and looked down at his neglected cock, the flesh so engorged and hard it had to be painful, and she felt a flush of guilt. She'd taken everything, and given so little. Just for the moment. Though she needed to catch her breath, Zala sat up and patted the cot. "Here, lie down. Your turn." So he wouldn't have any cause to wonder or doubt her, she grasped his cock, brushing her thumb along the sensitive underside. He sucked in a startled breath, his eyes widening, but his surprise soon turned to relief. He lay flat on his back, again so earnest she almost laughed. She climbed onto the cot again, straddling his thighs as she gripped his shaft with one hand and ran the other over the sweat-slicked skin of his chest and abdomen. His cock strained under her touch, and she slid her fingers along it, watching the blissful expression that filled Talon's face, the way he closed his eyes, trusting her completely. Then she lowered her head, bringing her tongue along his head, tracing the contours of his penis. This time, he was the one to wrap his hands around the edges of the cot, his entire body tightening, almost quivering. She meant to take it slowly, to thoroughly show him the thrill of being a human male and to give him pleasure to erase all the pain, but he was already so hard, so ready. As she took him into her mouth, he arched, thrusting with need. He was nearly too much for her, but his eager response pleased her and filled her with pride at knowing she could make him tremble so. She softened her throat, taking all of him in and out. Sooner than she would have thought possible, her own body flushed with desire again, moistness slicking her inner thighs. Gods, she wanted him in her. "Zala," he whispered, half senseless cry, half warning. Knowing he would come soon, she drew back and shifted higher up his body. She rose up, positioning him between her legs, and came down, shuddering as he filled her. He cried her name again and gripped her hips, his intense violet eyes scorching her as they devoured her body. Soon they were rocking together at a frenzied pace, their earlier teasing no more than foreplay to this incredible experience. Sweat bathed his chest, and maybe it ran down hers as well. She lost all track of time, of the camp, of the world around them, of everything except for him. As she rode him, taking all of him over and over, the exquisite rubbing brought her to climax once again. His eyes locked onto hers, and she kept rocking with him until he exploded into her. She dropped down atop him, his cock still inside of her. She couldn't imagine wanting it anywhere else. "Zala," he said, kissing her, his intensity gone and only tenderness remaining. He stroked her face and rubbed her back. "I'm so glad you told me your name." "Me too." She kissed him back, though such a satisfied weariness filled her that she soon wanted nothing more than to lie on his chest, limbs entwined, claiming each other. "I knew you would be wonderful," he whispered, nuzzling her ear. She chuckled, too tired to protest. Praise for her sword-fighting ability she understood and accepted, but praise for acts in the bedroom, or on a cot? What a silly thing. Yet his words warmed her soul. The fact that he had clearly enjoyed himself making her happy. One day soon he would be a dragon again, and he would forget her and human love-making, but for the time being, he was hers. "You laugh, but I knew." He ran his hand down her back to cup her ass. "I've known since you killed Skarkov in the pit." His voice grew harder, almost intense again. "My interest was for you, only you. It's always for you." She shivered at that intensity, but liked it. Whether she should care this much about him was debatable, but she liked his words very much. Good. She lifted herself slightly, so she could look down into his face, into his eyes. She could lose herself in those eyes. "I want you to be mine. Only mine." The responding rumble in his throat might have been a growl or a purr, but there was no mistaking the satisfaction on his face or the swell of his cock inside of her. A moment ago she had been thinking of rest, but now she kissed him again, realizing they wouldn't get much sleep tonight.